So the NBA trade deadline has passed, and outside of the Chicago Bulls trading Zach LaVine just a few days ago, the Bulls stay put and have made no additional moves. That's right, Nikola Vucevic still remains with the team. They now have 6 point guards after acquiring Trey Jones and the LaVine deal, and they're all still on the team. Obviously, Lonzo Ball is still here after we learned from the Bulls that we reached an agreement on an extension with him last night. There was evidently a lot of talk, a lot of discussion surrounding multiple players and working on various trade scenarios, but ultimately nothing got done, and the Bulls roster remains intact from what it was yesterday. Now, I have a lot of thoughts on this, and what I'll say first and foremost is that I'm not surprised any of the young guys got moved, right? Like there were evidently a lot of interest in Kobe White. There was talk on whether the Bulls should actually trade Ayo Dosunmu as well, given his cheap contract and the value on the market. I'm not surprised they didn't try to trade Patrick Williams, given his value is pretty low at the moment. And no, I never thought for a second they would look to trade Josh Giddey, who becomes a restricted free agent this summer, and they have to eventually pay him a big contract. I'm not saying I agree with any of it, as I do believe everything sans Matas Buzelis should have been on the table and up for consideration at the trade deadline. I'm just saying I'm not surprised they weren't moved, because we all know this front office very much overvalues their players. And so I'm sure there were teams interested. I'm sure there were a lot of offers and interest on the market. In fact, that was confirmed in reports, but I'm sure the Bulls were asking for the moon and teams were saying no thanks, which that in and of itself continues to be a problem with this front office and how they run things, because they don't trade their players at the optimal times. They kick the can down the road and they trade them when it's too late and don't get as much value for them. That's what happened with Caruso. That's what happened with DeMar. Same with Andre Drummond, when they could have gotten a couple second-round picks for him, but then let him walk for nothing in free agency. But yes, I'm not surprised that none of the young guys were moved. But I was shocked by the fact that the Bulls did not move Nikola Vucevic. I mean, if you saw my predictions video on what I thought was going to happen about a week ago leading up to the deadline, I thought the only guy that was actually going to be traded was Vucevic, not LaVine. I actually thought they were going to try and keep LaVine because of the season he was having, the impact he was having on the players, but I thought there was little to no scenario where Vucevic would remain on this roster after the deadline. And what I will say is, this was a massive fumble on the part of the front office to not trade Vucevic, because last season and over the offseason, there wasn't a team who would even consider touching Vucevic on the trade market. The Bulls would have had to attach assets just to get him off the books. But now, after the improved play from Vuce this season, back to his shooting form from his Orlando days, much better finishing around the rim, sitting with the highest box plus minus on the team right now, this was your opportunity to actually get something of value for Vuce. This was the time. Yeah, it probably wasn't going to be anything great. I mean, you're talking about maybe a couple second round picks or two, but so be it. Because you know what? Vuce's value going into the offseason, where his numbers are probably going to drop off a bit while the Bulls go in a rebuild for the rest of the season and the youth gets prioritized, and how he's also going to be 35 years old going into the following season, you're probably not going to get much of anything for him on an expiring contract this summer. It was reported that the Warriors were still in talks with the Bulls even after they acquired Jimmy Butler, so that wasn't off the table, but talks fizzled because the Bulls' asking price was evidently too high. Like, man, just take on the expiring contracts of Kevon Looney and Gary Payton, get a couple second-round picks and be done with it. Now, to be fair, we don't know what exactly was offered, or if the Warriors were wanting the Bulls to take on longer-term money than what Vuce has on the books, then no, it's probably not worth it. And I should be clear, if teams were wanting the Bulls to take on long-term contracts in order to trade Vuce, but getting minimal to no draft capital in return, then okay. I can see why they didn't move Vucevic, and in that instance, it would make sense to just keep him and see what might transpire in the offseason. But I don't know. I just have little faith in this front office that that was actually the case and why they stood pat here. I mean, you probably heard in AK's press conference post the deadline that just happened a few hours ago talking about how they value Vuce being a veteran leader and a mentor for the young guys. I mean, Vucevic is the guy that you see as a mentor for the young crew? I can understand with Lonzo Ball, but I don't see Vuce being that guy that picks these young guys up and shows them the ropes of how to get through the NBA journey of life. Side note, by the way, that press conference that we saw from Arturas Karnisovas was really, really cringe. I mean, from the prepared statement where AK misread some of the words and stumbling around while reading, to a lot of non-answers to questions, repeating the same answers we've been hearing for years, referencing what they did 3.5 years ago as sort of this, trust me bro, we know what we're doing, look what we did 3.5 years ago and it worked for a half a season. I don't know, man. I've said this before in some of the other press conferences that we've seen from AK, but AK's demeanor, his tone, the words that he uses, I'm like, is this guy just not good with the media and public speaking, or is he just really not that bright? Because some of his comments in that presser were really embarrassing. And look, I feel like I, more so than a lot of Bulls fans, defend AK. Like, I think there is a lot to criticize for how he's run things since taking over, and there are a lot of bad things that he's done, but at the same time, I do feel like a lot of Bulls fans overreact just to how bad he actually has been. But the more and more historical data we get from what AK and Mark Eversley have done as leaders, the more these press conferences that offer up no inspiration, canned responses, no charisma, the more and more I'm having a hell of a hard time defending the front office and their decisions. Now, Casey Johnson did say right after the deadline passed that they at least laid out a groundwork for this summer for more changes to happen. But here's the thing that worries me. With the way Arturas has mishandled so many negotiations over the past year and a half, putting out insanely high asking prices for his players, waiting around until it's too late when they have to sell off their players for much less, no GM or executives are going to take them seriously. Like, they've already set that reputation for themselves. Not being credible, not being competent enough to run a franchise. GMs are going to say, hey, don't give in to their demands. They'll eventually cave and you can take them to the cleaners. That's a horrible precedent and reputation to set for yourself if you're actually trying to build out a team when your peers don't respect you and think you don't know what you're doing. Like, it was recently said by Sam Amick when he was doing a survey of all the executives around the league on who they think are the top 5 executives in the NBA, and a bunch of them were open to share their bottom 5, and so many of them threw Chicago in the bottom 5. So yeah, forgive me if I have my doubts on whether this front office has actually laid the groundwork for more changes to be made over the offseason, because outside of getting incredibly lucky in the draft or Modest breaking out into a superstar, this franchise has a long road ahead in getting back to relevance. I'm not even just talking about getting back to championship aspirations, but back to relevance where they're a respectable enough of a team. Now, there was something I did want to say regarding some of AK's comments in the press conference that I see a lot of fans up in arms about. AK did say he believes the Bulls are in a transitional phase and that there is more work to be done, but also believes that the Bulls could still make a playoff run. And he later clarified that when asked that it doesn't really mean that they're necessarily trying to make the playoffs or push for the playoffs or be competitive, but more so that if the young guys play well, develop, exceed expectations, and manage to win games, that he won't stand in the way of that, and how that's a strong sign of development and growth. He then added that if the young core leads them to a play-in or even the playoffs, that it's obviously at the expense of lowering draft lottery odds or draft positioning in general, but stated that's worth it to him. And look, I know this sounds contradictory to what he's been saying as far as the Bulls taking a step back, working on their young guys, prioritizing young player development, trading away their best player in Zach LaVine. That signals a path to trying to not make the playoffs and improve your draft lottery odds. But what he's saying, and this is something I've honestly been saying since before the start of the season, when the Bulls pick was only top 10 projected at that time, if the young guys exceed expectations, if they're somehow playing better, growing and developing as a unit better than expected, and it leads to more wins, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, that's what you should want in a development year and a youth movement. Because what good is a youth movement and prioritizing player development if the young guys aren't developing or just straight up playing poorly? Great, you're losing games, you get a higher lottery pick, which is fine, but you want to see the guys that you currently have on your roster growing and improving. And I know I said this before as well, the last thing you want to see is for the guys to be playing well together, playing better than expected. Take Modest as an example when he's showing incredible strides, and maybe his play is actually leading to the Bulls winning more games. You're saying you would rather the Bulls bench him, or even some of the other guys like Pat, Julian Phillips, Kobe White, have them, take some nights off and play freaking EJ Liddell, Adama Sanogo, or Javon Carter so the Bulls can lose a few extra games to improve their lottery odds? No. It's more detrimental to try and slow down the growth of the young guys, all for the sake of getting a better pick. Let the young guns do their thing, and if they exceed expectations and win some more games that even gets them to the playoffs, I don't think that's going to happen, by the way, but say it does, then so be it. Instilling a winning mentality and confidence in these young players is more important than a crapshoot draft pick that already has a very small chance of landing at number 1 or number 2. I know I'm in the minority in that opinion, but I would much rather see these young guys build their experience and confidence than try and manufacture more losses by sitting them out because the team is winning more games than expected and they need to lose more to get a higher draft pick. Now, that said, I don't think the Bulls front office have done themselves any favors, because even regardless of your intentions and even if the young core wins more games than expected, you're still not setting yourself up for You're still not setting yourself up for success when you acquired 0 draft picks by trading Zach, DeMar, and Caruso, except getting your own first-round draft pick that you mistakenly traded away in the first place. That's where they really failed at this trade deadline, and of course, trade deadlines of the past, in not acquiring the requisite draft capital to set them up further to build on their young core and give them more assets to work with for the future outside of just their own pick in this upcoming draft. Anyway, yeah, I still can't believe they didn't make any additional moves outside of trading Zach LaVine, because we all thought once they moved Zach, we would see this clear direction, which is a little more clear, but not when they still have the likes of Vucevic at his age and also 6 point guards on the roster. Like, at a minimum, trade some of your guards to get a more balanced roster. I don't know, man. I guess we'll see how these remaining 30 games go, as AK said multiple times in his press conference. So let me know what you guys thought of the lack of moves. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.